Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been the type to blend into crowds. At 5'4", with an unremarkable build and quiet demeanor, she moved through the naval base like a ghost. Most people barely noticed her, which was exactly how she preferred it. After 15 years of distinguished service, she had learned that sometimes the best leaders were the ones who listened more than they spoke. On this particular Tuesday morning in July, Sarah was dressed in civilian clothes, faded jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and worn sneakers. She had arrived at Naval Station Norfolk 2 hours early for a classified briefing, but the meeting had been postponed until afternoon. Rather than return to her temporary quarters, she decided to explore the base and observe the daily operations firsthand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete as Sarah walked past the training facilities. She paused near the obstacle course where a group of new recruits was struggling through their morning exercises. Their instructor, a burly petty officer with a voice that could wake the dead, was shouting encouragement and corrections in equal measure. "Move it! Move it! Your grandmother could crawl faster than that!" Sarah smiled slightly, remembering her own brutal training days. Every sailor had been through this crucible of sweat, exhaustion, and determination. It was a universal experience that bound them together regardless of rank or specialty. As she continued her walk, Sarah noticed a small crowd gathering near the main administrative building. Curious, she approached and saw they were watching a group of officers engaged in what appeared to be an impromptu water balloon fight. The participants were clearly off-duty, judging by their casual clothes and relaxed attitudes. At the center of the action was Captain Marcus Webb, a tall man with sandy hair and an infectious grin. Sarah recognized him from his file, a rising star in the Navy with an impressive record in submarine warfare. He was known for his tactical brilliance, his ability to inspire loyalty in his crews, and unfortunately, his legendary practical jokes. Captain Webb was currently orchestrating what he called a morale-building exercise with several junior officers. They had set up an elaborate prank involving water balloons, super soakers, and various other water-based weapons. The target seemed to be anyone unlucky enough to walk past their impromptu battle zone. Sarah watched from a safe distance as Webb and his accomplices ambushed an unsuspecting yeoman who was trying to deliver papers to the building. The young sailor took the soaking with good humor, even participating in a brief counterattack before continuing on his mission. "This is actually brilliant," thought one of the watching sailors. "Captain Webb always knows how to boost morale when things get too serious around here." Sarah had to admit that the captain's approach had merit. Military life could be incredibly stressful, and finding healthy ways to blow off steam was essential for maintaining unit cohesion and mental health. However, she also noticed that the participants were being somewhat indiscriminate in their target selection. As she observed the scene, Sarah became aware that someone was sneaking up behind her with what appeared to be a large water gun. She turned slightly and saw a young ensign trying to get into position for an ambush. Rather than spoil his fun, she pretended not to notice and continued watching the main action. The ensign fired his shot, but his aim was poor, and the stream of water missed Sarah entirely, instead hitting a nearby flower pot. Embarrassed, he retreated to reload and try again. Sarah found his persistence amusing and decided to make herself an easier target by moving closer to the action. Captain Webb noticed the small woman in civilian clothes approaching and initially assumed she was either a contractor or perhaps a family member visiting the base. He had been looking for a new target to liven up the game. And she seemed perfect, close enough to hit, apparently unaware of the ongoing battle, and civilian enough that the prank would be harmless fun rather than a breach of military protocol. Webb grabbed a can of Coca-Cola from a nearby cooler that someone had brought out to keep the participants hydrated. He had discovered that soda made for an excellent prank weapon. It was sticky enough to be annoying, harmless enough to be funny, and unexpected enough to get a great reaction from victims. Sarah was genuinely absorbed in watching the tactics being employed by both sides of the water fight. From a professional standpoint, It was fascinating to see how the officers adapted their training to this playful scenario. They were using legitimate military concepts, flanking maneuvers, coordinated attacks, strategic retreats, but applying them to a completely different context. She was so focused on analyzing their techniques that she failed to notice Captain Webb approaching from her blind spot with the can of Coke. Webb had perfected the art of the surprise soda attack over years of practice. The key was to approach silently, get within optimal range, and then shake the can vigorously while simultaneously popping the top. This created maximum spray coverage and minimum reaction time for the target. He positioned himself about 6 feet behind Sarah and began the shake-and-release sequence. The carbonated beverage exploded outward in a brown, fizzy fountain that caught her completely by surprise. The cold liquid soaked her hair, ran down her face, and thoroughly drenched her white t-shirt. Sarah stood motionless for a moment, processing what had just happened. Cola dripped from her chin onto her sneakers while the sweet, sticky liquid began to soak through her clothes. Around her, the other participants in the water fight burst into laughter and applause at Webb's successful ambush. "Got her good, Captain!" shouted one of the junior officers. "Look at her face!" Webb was grinning broadly, clearly pleased with his handiwork. "Welcome to Norfolk, miss. Consider that your official base greeting." Sarah slowly turned around to face her attacker. Her expression was unreadable as she wiped Coca-Cola from her eyes and pushed her wet hair back from her forehead. The crowd that had gathered to watch the water fight was now focused entirely on this new development. "That was an impressive tactical approach," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying easily despite being quiet. "Good use of distraction and misdirection." Webb was momentarily taken aback by her composed reaction. Most civilians would have been either angry or flustered after being doused with soda. This woman seemed almost analytical about the whole thing. "Sorry about that," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry at all. "It's all in good fun. We're just trying to keep things light around here." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I can appreciate the value of maintaining morale through unconventional means. However, you might want to be more selective about your targets in the future." Something in her tone made Webb pause. There was an authority in her voice that seemed inconsistent with her civilian appearance. But before he could dwell on it, one of his accomplices handed him another can of soda. "Come on, Captain! Don't let her lecture you! Hit her again!" The crowd began chanting encouragement, caught up in the excitement of the moment. Sarah noticed several phone cameras had appeared, with sailors recording what they clearly thought was hilarious footage of a civilian getting pranked by their popular captain. Webb looked at the second can, then at Sarah, then back at the can. The peer pressure was mounting, and his reputation as the base's premier practical joker was at stake. Plus, the woman didn't seem particularly upset about the first attack, so surely she could take another one in the spirit of fun. Sarah realized what was about to happen and made no move to avoid it. She was curious to see how far Captain Webb was willing to push this situation, and her anthropological interest in human behavior under social pressure overrode any concern about getting wetter. "Here comes round 2, Webb announced, shaking the second can with theatrical flair. This time he aimed more carefully, directing the spray to cover the areas he had missed with the first attack. Sarah took the full force of the carbonated assault, now thoroughly soaked from head to toe in cola. Her jeans were drenched, her sneakers were squelching, and her hair was plastered to her head with sticky brown liquid. The crowd erupted in cheers and laughter. Several sailors were high-fiving each other, and someone started a slow clap that quickly spread through the group. Captain Webb took a bow, basking in the approval of his audience. Sarah stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, looking like she had been caught in a brown rainstorm. Cola dripped steadily from her clothes onto the concrete, forming a small puddle around her feet. Her expression remained neutral, almost thoughtful, as if she was considering some complex problem. "You know," she said conversationally, "in my experience, The most effective military operations are the ones where you fully understand your target before you engage. Webb was wiping his hands on his shorts, still grinning. It's just a prank, lady. Don't overthink it. Oh, I'm not overthinking anything, Sarah replied. I'm just observing that you've made some interesting assumptions about me without gathering adequate intelligence first. Now Webb was definitely picking up on something odd about this woman. Civilians didn't usually talk about intelligence gathering and target assessment, but the crowd was still laughing and cheering, and he wasn't about to back down in front of his junior officers. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, crossing his arms. Sarah reached into her back pocket and slowly withdrew a wallet. With deliberate movements, she opened it and removed what appeared to be an identification card. She held it up for Webb to see, though from his distance he couldn't make out the details. It means, Captain Webb, that you might want to work on your reconnaissance skills. The casual use of his name made Webb freeze. How did this random civilian know who he was? And why was she speaking to him with that particular tone of authority? Several of the closer observers were now squinting at the ID card Sarah was holding. One young lieutenant's eyes went wide as he managed to make out the text, and he immediately nudged the sailor next to him. A ripple of whispered conversation began spreading through the crowd. Sarah returned the card to her wallet and put it back in her pocket. I have to say, your tactical execution was flawless. Excellent timing, good use of available resources, and you maintained the element of surprise throughout both attacks. Webb was beginning to feel like he was missing some crucial piece of information. The woman's military vocabulary was too precise, her bearing too confident, and her reaction too composed for a random civilian. But she was clearly not in uniform, and he had never seen her on base before. Who are you? He asked directly. Sarah smiled for the first time since the prank began. It was not a particularly warm smile. That's an excellent question, Captain. One you probably should have asked before you decided to use me as target practice. The crowd around them had grown considerably, with off-duty sailors drawn by the commotion. Many were still laughing and joking about the successful prank, but others were beginning to notice the shift in atmosphere. The junior officers who had been participating in the water fight were starting to look less confident about their involvement. Sarah reached up and wrung some of the cola out of her hair. I arrived on base this morning for a classified briefing. Since I had some extra time, I thought I'd take a walk and observe the daily operations. She gestured at the wet stains covering her clothes. This has certainly been educational. Webb was rapidly running through possibilities in his mind. If she had legitimate business on base, she would need proper clearance. If she was attending classified briefings, she was probably either a government contractor or military personnel. But her civilian clothes and unfamiliar face suggested, "You're military," he said slowly, the realization beginning to dawn. "Very good, Captain," Sarah replied. "Though I have to say, your deductive reasoning skills work better than your target identification protocols." One of the junior officers, who had been part of the original water fight, stepped forward nervously. "Ma'am, if you're active duty, we should probably—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Sarah turned to look at him. Despite being soaked in soda and significantly shorter than most of the people around her, she somehow managed to project an unmistakable air of authority. "You should probably what, Lieutenant? We should probably apologize," he offered weakly. "Apologies are certainly appropriate," Sarah agreed. "But I'm more concerned about the lack of situational awareness you've all demonstrated. Military bases aren't playgrounds. You never know who might be observing your conduct." Webb was feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the implications of the situation became clear. If this woman was indeed military personnel, dousing her with Coca-Cola could be considered anything from a breach of protocol to assault, depending on her rank and his chain of command's sense of humor. "What's your rank?" he asked. though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Sarah tilted her head slightly. Another excellent question, one that might have been useful to ask about 30 minutes ago. The crowd around them had grown silent. What had started as hilarious entertainment was beginning to feel like a potential career-ending disaster for everyone involved. Several of the junior officers were already trying to edge away from the scene, hoping to distance themselves from whatever consequences were about to unfold. Webb realized he needed to take control of the situation before it got any worse. "Look, I'm sorry about the prank. If you're military personnel, I should have recognized that and acted more appropriately. Can we start over?" "Oh, we're well past the point of starting over, Captain," Sarah said calmly. "But I appreciate the sentiment." She looked around at the assembled crowd, taking in the mixture of curiosity, concern, and dawning horror on their faces. "I have to admit, this has been one of the more unique welcomes I've received at a new assignment." Webb's stomach dropped. "New assignment?" "Yes," Sarah replied, still speaking in that maddeningly calm voice. "I'm here to take command of the Joint Maritime Operations Center. My first official briefing is this afternoon, but I thought I'd get a feel for the base culture first." She gestured at her cola-soaked appearance. "Mission accomplished." Several people in the crowd made audible gasping sounds. The Joint Maritime Operations Center was one of the most critical commands on the base, responsible for coordinating naval operations across multiple theaters. Whoever was in charge of that facility would be... Webb's face went pale as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "What did you say your rank was?" Sarah's smile widened slightly, but it still wasn't what anyone would call friendly. "I didn't say. But since you ask..." She reached into her front pocket and withdrew a small, official-looking folder. With the same deliberate movements she had used with her ID card, she opened it and held it up for the crowd to see. Even from several feet away, the 4 stars on her credentials were unmistakable. "Rear Admiral Sarah Chen," she announced clearly. "United States Navy." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the steady drip of Coca-Cola hitting the concrete. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Captain Marcus Webb stared at the 4 stars displayed on Admiral Chen's credentials, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he had just done. Around him, the crowd of sailors who had been laughing and cheering moments before now stood frozen in various states of shock and horror. Admiral Sarah Chen calmly folded her credentials and returned them to her pocket. Cola continued to drip from her hair and clothes, creating small puddles on the concrete. Despite her disheveled appearance, she somehow managed to project an aura of complete composure and unmistakable authority. "Well," she said conversationally, breaking the oppressive silence, "this is certainly going to make for an interesting first day." Webb felt like he was going to be sick. In his 8-year naval career, he had never made a mistake this catastrophic. He had just doused a rear admiral, with Coca-Cola as part of what he thought was a harmless prank. The implications were staggering. His career was over. He would be lucky to avoid a court-martial. "Admiral," he began, his voice hoarse with shock, I can't. There are no words." "Take your time, Captain," Sarah replied patiently. "I imagine this is quite a lot to process." One of the junior officers, who had been part of the original water fight, took a shaky step forward. Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes was a promising young officer with a spotless record, and she was rapidly calculating how her participation in the prank might affect her future prospects. "Admiral Chen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was also involved in the activities. I take full responsibility for my part in what happened." Several other officers began stepping forward as well, ready to accept their share of the blame. Sarah watched this development with interest, noting how quickly the group dynamics had shifted from celebratory to penitent. "That's admirable, Lieutenant Hayes," Sarah said, addressing the young woman by name despite never having been introduced. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I haven't actually said what, if anything, I plan to do about this situation." Webb looked up sharply. There was something in the Admiral's tone that suggested this conversation might not go in the direction he expected, but he was too rattled to hope for anything approaching mercy. "Admiral, I accept full responsibility for what happened," he said formally. "My conduct was completely inappropriate and unbefitting an officer of the United States Navy. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Your acceptance of responsibility is noted, Captain Webb. But before we discuss consequences, I'm curious about something. What exactly did you think you were accomplishing with your water fight and practical jokes?" The question caught Webb off guard. He had expected immediate disciplinary action, not a philosophical discussion about his motivations. "Ma'am, we were trying to boost morale. The crew has been under a lot of stress lately with the extended deployment schedules and increased operational tempo. I thought some harmless fun might help everyone decompress and maintain unit cohesion." "Interesting," Sarah mused. "And in your assessment, was this approach effective?" Webb glanced around at the faces surrounding them. Despite their current mortification, he could see that his junior officers had indeed been more relaxed and engaged before the reveal of Sarah's identity. The water fight had generated genuine laughter and camaraderie. "Yes, ma'am. At least until now. The crew seemed to be enjoying themselves and working together better after letting off some steam." Sarah began walking slowly around the perimeter of the group, her soggy sneakers squelching with each step. The assembled sailors tracked her movement nervously, unsure what to expect from this unexpected inspection. "Leadership is a complex responsibility, Captain Webb," she said as she walked. "We need to maintain discipline and professionalism while also ensuring our people remain human beings rather than just cogs in a military machine. Finding that balance is one of the greatest challenges any commanding officer faces." Webb nodded cautiously, still not sure where this was leading. "Your instincts about the need for morale-building activities aren't wrong," Sarah continued. "Stress management and unit cohesion are legitimate concerns that require proactive leadership. However, your execution revealed some significant gaps in judgment." She stopped walking and turned to face the group directly. "Can anyone tell me what those gaps might have been?" Lieutenant Hayes raised her hand tentatively. "Ma'am, we failed to establish proper boundaries for our activities. We didn't consider who might be affected by our actions beyond our immediate group." "Excellent observation, Lieutenant. What else?" Another officer spoke up. "We didn't maintain situational awareness about our environment. A military base isn't an appropriate venue for uncontrolled recreational activities." "Also correct. Continue." Webb found his voice again. "We made assumptions about people without gathering proper information first. I targeted someone for a prank without knowing anything about them except their appearance." Sarah smiled slightly. "Now you're getting to the heart of the matter, Captain. Intelligence gathering and target assessment. These are fundamental military skills that apply to every aspect of our operations, not just combat scenarios." She walked back to stand directly in front of Webb. "When you decided to target me with your prank, what information did you use to make that decision?" Webb felt heat rising in his cheeks as he considered the question. I assumed you were a civilian contractor or family member because you were dressed casually and I didn't recognize you." "And those assumptions led you to conclude what, exactly?" "That you would be an appropriate target for a harmless prank," Webb admitted miserably. "I see. And at what point did you verify those assumptions?" "I didn't, ma'am. I acted on them without verification." Sarah nodded. This is exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed in operational environments, Captain. You gathered limited visual intelligence, made multiple assumptions based on that limited data, and then acted on those assumptions without attempting to verify their accuracy. The crowd around them was listening intently now. What had started as a disciplinary conversation was turning into an impromptu leadership lesson that none of them were likely to forget. In combat, that kind of flawed decision-making process could result in friendly fire incidents, civilian casualties, or mission failures. In this case, it resulted in you assaulting a superior officer with carbonated beverages. Webb winced at her blunt assessment. "Yes, ma'am. I understand that now." "Do you?" Sarah asked. "Because I'm not convinced you fully grasped the implications of what happened here today." She turned to address the entire crowd. "Every one of you witnessed Captain Webb make assumptions about an unknown individual and then act on those assumptions without verification. More importantly, many of you encouraged those actions or participated in them directly." Several sailors shifted uncomfortably as the full weight of their involvement became clear. This represents a systemic failure of judgment, not just an individual mistake. You collectively created an environment where poor decision-making was not only accepted, but actively encouraged. Lieutenant Hayes spoke up hesitantly. "Admiral, what should we have done differently?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "An excellent question, Lieutenant. Let's work through this as a learning exercise. Captain Webb, you identified a legitimate need, improving morale and reducing stress. What would have been a better approach to addressing that need?" Webb thought carefully before responding. "I should have coordinated with base leadership to establish appropriate recreational activities with proper oversight and boundaries." "Good. What else?" "I should have ensured that any activities we organized were conducted in appropriate locations and didn't interfere with base operations or affect uninvolved personnel." "Better. And regarding target selection for your pranks?" "I should never have targeted anyone without their explicit consent to participate in the activities." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Now you're demonstrating the kind of critical thinking I expect from my officers. The goal wasn't wrong, Captain Webb. Your methods needed work." She looked around at the assembled group. "I want all of you to remember this moment, not because you should be ashamed of making a mistake, but because you should never forget the importance of thinking before you act." Webb felt a flicker of hope. The Admiral's tone had shifted from stern correction to educational guidance. Maybe his career wasn't completely over after all. "Admiral," he said carefully, "what happens now?" Sarah reached up and wrung another stream of cola out of her hair. "Well, first I'm going to find somewhere to clean up before my briefing. Then I'm going to formally assume command of the Joint Maritime Operations Center and begin my assessment of current operations." "I meant, what happens to us? To me?" Sarah studied him for a long moment. "That depends entirely on what you do next, Captain Webb." "Ma'am? You've demonstrated that you have good instincts about leadership and crew welfare, but poor judgment about execution and risk assessment. The question is whether you can learn from this experience and become a better officer, or whether you'll repeat similar mistakes in the future." Webb straightened unconsciously, recognizing that he was being given an unexpected opportunity. "I can learn, ma'am. I will learn." "I hope so, because I'm going to be watching your performance very closely over the coming months. All of you," she added, looking around the group. Sarah began walking toward the administrative building, leaving a trail of sticky footprints behind her. "I expect a formal after-action report on today's incident within 48 hours, Captain Webb. Include your analysis of what went wrong, what you learned, and your recommendations for preventing similar incidents in the future." "Yes, ma'am," Webb replied, snapping to attention despite his civilian clothes. Sarah paused at the entrance to the building and turned back to face the crowd one final time. "One more thing. I want to see detailed proposals for legitimate morale and team-building activities from each of you within 1 week. If you're going to channel your creative energy into unit cohesion, let's make sure you do it right. Aye, aye, Admiral, came the chorus of responses. As Sarah disappeared into the building, the crowd remained frozen in place for several more seconds. Finally, Lieutenant Hayes broke the silence. "Holy shit," she whispered. "We just soaked an Admiral with Coca-Cola." "And somehow didn't get court-martialed," added another officer in amazement. Webb was still staring at the door where Sarah had vanished. "She's not done with us yet," he said quietly. "This was just the beginning." Over the next several hours, word of the incident spread throughout the base, with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. By noon, every sailor on Norfolk knew that Captain Webb had pranked the new admiral and somehow lived to tell about it. The story grew more elaborate with each retelling, taking on almost mythological proportions. Some versions had Webb dousing the admiral with an entire cooler of soda. Others claimed she had been wearing her dress uniform at the time. A particularly creative variant suggested that the admiral had retaliated by dunking Webb in the base fountain. But those who had been present knew the truth was both simpler and more complex than any of the rumors. They had witnessed something rare, a senior officer who could have destroyed careers with a single word, choosing instead to turn a catastrophic mistake into a teaching moment. Webb spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious productivity, drafting and redrafting his after-action report. He interviewed everyone who had been involved, analyzed every aspect of the incident, and worked to understand not just what had gone wrong, but why. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Admiral Chen's response had been a masterclass in leadership. She had taken a situation that could have resulted in widespread disciplinary action and transformed it into an opportunity for professional development. She had been firm without being destructive, educational without being condescending. As evening approached, Webb found himself walking past the administrative building where the Admiral's briefing was presumably taking place. He wondered what her first official meeting as base commander had been like, given her unconventional introduction to Norfolk. He also found himself looking forward to their next interaction with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Admiral Chen had made it clear that this was only the beginning of their relationship, not the end. She would be watching, evaluating, and expecting improvement. For the first time since the morning's disaster, Webb allowed himself to smile. He had been given a second chance by someone who could have ended his career without a second thought. Now he had to prove that her faith in his ability to learn and grow wasn't misplaced. The real test was just beginning. 3 months later, Captain Marcus Webb stood at attention outside Admiral Sarah Chen's office, holding a thick folder containing his quarterly performance evaluation. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Joint Maritime Operations Center, illuminating walls that now displayed charts, commendations, and photographs documenting the significant improvements that had taken place under the Admiral's leadership. Webb had spent countless hours in this building over the past few months, working directly with Admiral Chen on various initiatives. What had started as a catastrophic first impression had evolved into one of the most productive and educational professional relationships of his career. "Enter," came the familiar voice from within the office. Webb stepped inside to find Admiral Chen seated behind her desk, reviewing what appeared to be operational reports from the Mediterranean fleet. She was wearing her service dress blues, every detail perfect and professional. It was a stark contrast to the cola-soaked civilian clothes he remembered from their first encounter. "Good morning, Captain Webb," she said, looking up from her papers. "Please have a seat." Webb settled into the chair across from her desk, placing his evaluation folder on the small table beside him. The office was meticulously organized, but also surprisingly personal, with photographs of various naval operations and a small collection of books on leadership and military history. I've reviewed your quarterly assessment, Admiral Chen began, and I have to say the transformation in your performance has been remarkable. Webb felt a surge of pride mixed with relief. The past 3 months had been the most challenging and rewarding period of his career. Under Admiral Chen's guidance, he had completely restructured his approach to leadership, decision-making, and crew management. Thank you, ma'am. I've tried to implement everything I learned from our initial encounter. Sarah smiled slightly at the diplomatic reference to the cola incident. Your morale and team-building programs have become a model for other commands. The structured recreational activities you've implemented have reduced stress-related incidents by 30% while maintaining the highest readiness levels we've seen in years. This was true. Webb's new approach to unit cohesion had been revolutionary in its effectiveness. Instead of spontaneous pranks and uncontrolled activities, he had developed a comprehensive program of organized events, team challenges, and structured recreational opportunities. Every activity had clear objectives, defined boundaries, and appropriate oversight. The key was understanding the difference between leadership and entertainment, Webb replied. You taught me that building morale doesn't mean abandoning discipline or situational awareness. Exactly, and your application of that principle has been exemplary. Sarah pulled out a different set of documents. In fact, I've been asked to recommend candidates for the Advanced Leadership Development Program. Your name is at the top of my list. Webb's eyes widened. The Advanced Leadership Development Program was one of the most prestigious educational opportunities the Navy offered. Selection was extremely competitive, and graduates typically went on to hold major command positions. Admiral, I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept the nomination, Sarah replied. Your growth over these past months has demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptability and learning capacity the Navy needs in its senior officers. Webb thought back to that terrifying moment when he had realized he had just doused an admiral with soda. At the time, he had been certain his career was over. Instead, it had become the catalyst for professional development he never could have imagined. I absolutely accept, ma'am. And I want you to know how grateful I am for the opportunity you gave me to learn from my mistakes rather than simply being punished for them. Sarah leaned back in her chair. That brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you, Captain. Your experience has helped me implement some significant changes in how we handle disciplinary issues and professional development throughout the command. Over the past 3 months, Admiral Chen had revolutionized the culture at Naval Station Norfolk. Her approach to the cola incident had become legendary not just for its humor, but for its effectiveness as a leadership example. Word of her methods had spread throughout the fleet, and other commanders had begun requesting guidance on implementing similar approaches. I've been developing a new training protocol based on what we learned from your situation, Sarah continued. Instead of treating every mistake as a failure requiring punishment, we're creating systems to identify teachable moments and convert errors into educational opportunities. She handed Webb a thick manual titled Adaptive Leadership and Error Recovery in Military Operations. His name appeared on the cover as co-author alongside Admiral Chen. You want me to help develop Navy-wide training protocols? Webb asked, flipping through the document with amazement. Your insights into the decision-making process that led to the original incident have been invaluable. You understand both the mindset that creates these problems and the learning process necessary to overcome them. Webb found himself remembering the paralysis and terror he had felt that first day when he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Then he thought about the careful, patient way Admiral Chen had guided him through understanding not just what he had done wrong, but why he had made those choices. The program focuses on 3 core principles, Sarah explained. First, immediate accountability. People must acknowledge and take responsibility for their actions. Second, analytical understanding. They must demonstrate genuine comprehension of what went wrong and why. Third, constructive application. They must show they can use that understanding to make better decisions in the future. That's exactly the process you put me through, Webb realized. Precisely, and the results speak for themselves. You've not only become a better officer, you've become a better leader and mentor for others. This was undeniably true. Webb's junior officers had noticed the dramatic improvement in his leadership style. He was more thoughtful in his decision-making, more considerate of consequences, and much better at creating learning opportunities for his subordinates. Several young officers had specifically requested to serve under his command. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Sarah said, her tone becoming more personal. "I've received orders for my next assignment. I'll be taking command of the 7th Fleet operations in the Pacific." Webb felt a pang of disappointment. Admiral Chen had become not just a commanding officer, but a mentor whose guidance had transformed his career. The thought of losing that professional relationship was genuinely distressing. "That's a tremendous honor, ma'am. The 7th Fleet is one of the most critical commands in the Navy." "It is. And I'll need experienced officers who understand my leadership philosophy and can help implement these new training protocols on a larger scale." She paused meaningfully. "I'd like you to consider joining my staff as Director of Professional Development." Webb nearly fell out of his chair. "Ma'am, are you offering me a position on your senior staff?" "I'm offering you the chance to help reshape how the Navy develops and retains its best officers. Your experience with learning from failure and turning mistakes into growth opportunities could benefit thousands of sailors." The irony was overwhelming. A catastrophic error in judgment that should have ended his career was instead opening doors to opportunities he had never dreamed possible. And it was all because Admiral Chen had seen potential for growth where others might have seen only the need for punishment. "I would be honored to serve on your staff, Admiral." Sarah smiled warmly. "Excellent. We'll have a lot of work to do. The Pacific Fleet presents unique challenges, and implementing culture change across such a large organization will require careful planning and execution." She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the base. "You know, Captain Webb, that morning 3 months ago when you soaked me with Coca-Cola, I learned something important too." Webb looked surprised. "What was that, ma'am?" "I learned that sometimes the best leaders are the ones who are willing to admit their mistakes and work to do better, not just the ones who never make mistakes in the first place." She turned back to face him. "Your willingness to accept responsibility, learn from the experience, and apply that learning to become a better officer told me everything I needed to know about your character and potential." Webb stood and moved to join her at the window. Below them, sailors were going about their daily duties with the kind of purposeful efficiency that marked a well-run command. The base that had seemed chaotic and undisciplined 3 months ago now functioned like a precision instrument. "I still can't believe you turned that disaster into a career opportunity," he said. "Leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes, Captain. It's about what you do after the mistakes happen. Anyone can maintain order when everything goes according to plan. The real test of leadership comes when things go wrong." As if summoned by their conversation, Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes appeared in the doorway. She had been promoted to lieutenant commander and now served as Webb's deputy in the morale and welfare programs. "Excuse me, Admiral Captain, but I wanted to report that the base-wide team-building exercise has been completed successfully. All units participated, no incidents occurred, and crew satisfaction ratings are at an all-time high." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Outstanding work, Commander Hayes. Your attention to detail and risk management protocols made all the difference." After Hayes departed, Webb reflected on how many careers had been positively affected by that one morning's events. The lessons learned from the cola incident had rippled throughout the command, creating a culture where mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than career-ending disasters. "Admiral," he said, I have a confession to make." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had recognized you that morning. If I had known you were the new base commander, I never would have pulled that prank." "And what conclusion have you reached?" Webb grinned. "I think it was the best mistake I ever made." Sarah laughed, the first time Webb had heard her genuinely laugh since their initial encounter. "You know what, Captain? I think you might be right." 6 months later, Webb stood on the deck of the USS Blue Ridge in Pearl Harbor, watching Admiral Chen conduct her first fleet exercise as commander of the 7th Fleet. The operations were flawlessly executed, with ships and aircraft from multiple nations participating in complex scenarios designed to test readiness and interoperability. But what impressed Webb most was watching Admiral Chen work with officers who made mistakes during the exercise. Instead of immediate discipline or harsh criticism, she used the same patient, educational approach she had demonstrated with him that first day at Norfolk. A young destroyer captain who had misinterpreted a communications protocol found himself in a one-on-one discussion with the Admiral that left him better informed and more confident rather than demoralized and defensive. A submarine commander who had surfaced in the wrong location received guidance on navigation procedures that helped him understand not just his error, but the underlying principles that would prevent similar mistakes. The new professional development program they had developed together was being implemented throughout the Pacific Fleet, and the results were remarkable. Retention rates were up, performance evaluations showed consistent improvement, and the fleet's overall readiness had reached unprecedented levels. Webb's role as Director of Professional Development had given him the opportunity to work with officers at every level, from fresh ensigns to seasoned commanders. He found that his personal experience with learning from catastrophic failure resonated with people facing their own challenges and setbacks. During a brief break in the exercise, Admiral Chen joined Webb at the rail of the command ship. The Pacific stretched endlessly before them, dotted with the ships of the most powerful naval force in the world. "Any regrets about leaving Norfolk?" she asked. Webb considered the question seriously. "None at all, ma'am. This is exactly where I belong." "Even though it all started with you dumping soda on a superior officer?" "Especially because it started that way," Webb replied with a smile. "It taught me that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn, grow, and help others do the same." Sarah nodded approvingly. "You've come a long way from that morning when you thought your career was over." "We both have, Admiral. That incident changed how I think about command, about mistakes, about the whole purpose of military leadership." As they watched the sun set over the Pacific, Webb reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A simple prank had become a life-changing lesson in leadership, accountability, and the power of turning failure into opportunity. He thought about all the young officers who would benefit from the programs they had developed, all the careers that would be saved and enhanced by treating mistakes as learning opportunities rather than grounds for punishment. The ripple effects of that one cola-soaked morning would continue to influence the Navy for years to come. "Admiral," he said finally, "thank you." "For what, Captain?" "For seeing potential where others might have seen only problems, for choosing to teach instead of punish, for showing me that the best leaders are the ones who help others become better than they ever thought possible." Admiral Sarah Chen smiled as she watched her fleet navigate the challenging waters of the Pacific. "That's what leadership is about, Captain Webb. Not avoiding mistakes, but learning from them. Not maintaining perfection, but pursuing constant improvement." As the exercise continued into the evening, Webb realized that his story had become part of Navy legend, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of practical jokes, but as an example of transformational leadership in action. Young officers throughout the fleet now knew that making a mistake didn't have to mean the end of their careers, as long as they were willing to learn, grow, and do better. The captain, who had once drenched an admiral in Coca-Cola, had become one of the Navy's most effective advocates for professional development and second chances, and the admiral, who had been soaked that morning, had proven that sometimes the best response to crisis is not punishment, but opportunity. Their partnership had changed not just their own careers, but the entire culture of military leadership, and it all began with a simple misunderstanding, a can of soda, and a leader who chose to teach rather than condemn.